early 19th century, the Bennet family lives at their Longbourn estate, situated near the village of Meryton in Hertfordshire, England. Mrs. Bennet's greatest desire is to marry off her 5 daughters to secure their futures. The arrival of Mr. Bingley, a rich bachelor who rents the neighbouring Netherfield estate, gives her hope that one of her daughters might contract a marriage to the advantage, because it is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune, must be in want of a wife. At a ball, the family is introduced to the Netherfield party, including Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters and Mr. Darcy, his dearest friend. Mr. Bingley's friendly and cheerful manner earns him popularity among the guests. He appears interested in Jane, the eldest Bennet daughter. Mr. Darcy, reputed to be twice as wealthy as Mr. Bingley, is haughty and aloof, causing a decided dislike of him. He declines to dance with Elizabeth, the second eldest Bennet daughter, as she is not handsome enough. Although she jokes about it with her friend, Elizabeth is deeply offended. Despite this first impression, Mr. Darcy secretly begins to find himself drawn to Elizabeth as they continue to encounter each other at social events, appreciating her wit and frankness. Mr. Collins, the heir to the Longbourn estate, visits the Bennet family with the intention of finding a wife among the 5 girls under the advice of his patroness Lady Catherine de Bourgh, also revealed to be Mr. Darcy's aunt. He decides to pursue Elizabeth. The Bennet family meets the charming army officer George Wickham, who tells Elizabeth in confidence about Mr. Darcy's unpleasant treatment of him in the past. Elizabeth, blinded by her prejudice toward Mr. Darcy, believes him. Elizabeth dances with Mr. Darcy at a ball, where Mrs. Bennet hints loudly that she expects Jane and Bingley to become engaged. Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins' marriage proposal, to her mother's fury and her father's relief. Mr. Collins subsequently proposes to Charlotte Lucas, a friend of Elizabeth, and is accepted. Having heard Mrs. Bennet's words at the ball and disapproving of the marriage, Mr. Darcy joins Mr. Bingley in a trip to London and, with the help of his sisters, persuades him not to return to Netherfield. A heartbroken Jane visits her aunt and uncle Gardiner in London to raise her spirits, while Elizabeth's hatred for Mr. Darcy grows as she suspects he was responsible for Mr. Bingley's departure. In the spring, Elizabeth visits Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Kent. Elizabeth and her hosts are invited to Rosings Park, Lady Catherine's home. Mr. Darcy and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, are also visiting Rosings Park. Fitzwilliam tells Elizabeth how Mr. Darcy recently saved a friend, presumably Bingley, from an undesirable match. Elizabeth realizes that the prevented engagement was to Jane. Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, declaring his love for her despite her low social connections. She is shocked, as she was unaware of Mr. Darcy's interest, and rejects him angrily, saying that he is the last person she would ever marry and that she could never love a man who caused her sister such unhappiness. She further accuses him of treating Wickham unjustly. Mr. Darcy brags about his success in separating Bingley and Jane and sarcastically dismisses the accusation regarding Wickham without addressing it. The next day, Mr. Darcy gives Elizabeth a letter, explaining that Wickham, the son of his late father's steward, had refused the living his father had arranged for him and was instead given money for it. Wickham quickly squandered the money and tried to elope with Darcy's 15-year-old sister, Georgiana, for her considerable dowry. Mr. Darcy also writes that he separated Jane and Bingley because he believed her to be indifferent to Bingley and because of the lack of propriety displayed by her family. Elizabeth is ashamed by her family's behavior and her own prejudice against Mr. Darcy. Months later, Elizabeth accompanies the Gardiners on a tour of Derbyshire. They visit Pemberley, Darcy's estate. When Mr. Darcy returns unexpectedly, he is exceedingly gracious with Elizabeth and the Gardiners. Elizabeth is surprised by Darcy's behavior and grows fond of him, even coming to regret rejecting his proposal. She receives news that her sister Lydia has run off with Wickham. She tells Mr. Darcy, then departs in haste. After an agonizing interim, Wickham agrees to marry Lydia. Lydia and Wickham visit the Bennet family at Longbourn, where Lydia tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy was at her wedding. Though Mr. Darcy had sworn everyone involved to secrecy, Mrs. Gardiner now feels obliged to inform Elizabeth that he secured the match, at great expense and trouble to himself. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy return to Netherfield. Jane accepts Mr. Bingley's proposal. Lady Catherine, having heard rumours that Elizabeth intends to marry Mr. Darcy, visits her and demands she promise never to accept Mr. Darcy's proposal, as she and Darcy's late mother had already planned his marriage to her daughter Anne. Elizabeth refuses and asks the outraged Lady Catherine to leave. Darcy, hardened by his aunt's indignant relaying of Elizabeth's response, again proposes to her and is accepted. Elizabeth Bennet the second eldest of the Bennet daughters, she is attractive, witty, and intelligent but with a tendency to form tenacious and prejudiced first impressions. As the story progresses, so does her tumultuous relationship with Mr. Darcy. The course of Elizabeth and Darcy's relationship is ultimately decided when Darcy overcomes his pride, and Elizabeth overcomes her prejudice, leading them both to surrender to their love for each other. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy Mr. Bingley's friend and the wealthy owner of the estate of Pemberley in Derbyshire, said to be worth at least £100,000 a year. Although he is handsome, tall, and intelligent, Darcy lacks ease and social graces, so others frequently mistake his initially haughty reserve as proof of excessive pride. A new visitor to the Meryton setting of the novel, he is ultimately Elizabeth Bennet's love interest. Though he appears to be proud and is largely disliked by people for this reason, his servants vouch for his kindness and decency. Mr. Bennet a logical and reasonable late middle-aged landed gentleman of a more modest income of £2000 per annum, and the dryly sarcastic patriarch of the Bennet family, with 5 unmarried daughters. His estate, Longbourn, is entailed to the male line. His affection for his wife wore off early in their marriage and is now reduced to mere toleration. He is often described as indolent in the novel. Mrs. Bennet, N.A. Copyright E. Gardiner, the middle-aged wife of Mr. Bennet, and the mother of their 5 daughters. Mrs. Bennet is a hypochondriac who imagines herself susceptible to attacks of tremors and palpitations, her poor nerves, whenever things are not going her way. She is silly, frivolous, and tactless, and is given to embarrassing her husband and older daughters. Her main ambition in life is to marry her daughters off to wealthy men. Whether or not any such matches will give her daughters happiness is of little concern to her. She was settled a dowry of £4,000 from her father. In a letter to Cassandra dated May 1813, Jane Austen describes a picture she saw at a gallery which was a good likeness of Mrs. Bingley Jane Bennet. Deirdre L. E. Fay in the world of her novels suggests that portrait of MRSQ is the picture Austen was referring to. Pages 201-203. Jane Bennet the eldest Bennet sister. She is considered the most beautiful young lady in the neighbourhood and is inclined to see only the good in others, but can be persuaded otherwise on sufficient evidence. She falls in love with Charles Bingley, a rich young man recently moved to Hertfordshire and a close friend of Mr. Darcy. Mary Bennet the middle Bennet sister, and the plainest of her siblings. Mary has a serious disposition and mostly reads and plays music, although she is often impatient to display her accomplishments and is rather vain about them. She frequently moralises to her family. According to James Edward Austen Leah's A Memoir of Jane Austen, Mary ended up marrying one of her Uncle Philip's law clerks and moving into Meryton with him. Catherine Kitty Bennet the 4th Bennet daughter. Though older than Lydia, she is her shadow and follows her in her pursuit of the officers of the militia. She is often portrayed as envious of Lydia and is described as a silly young woman. However, it is said that she improved when removed from Lydia's influence. According to James Edward Austen Leah's A Memoir of Jane Austen, Kitty later married a clergyman who lived near Pemberley. Lydia Bennet the youngest Bennet sister. She is frivolous, headstrong, irresponsible, and spoiled, and is her mother's favorite. Her main activity in life is socializing, especially flirting with the officers of the militia. This leads to her running off with George Wickham, although he has no intention of marrying her. Lydia shows no regard for the moral code of her society, as Ashley Tauchert says, she feels without reasoning. 5. Charles Bingley a handsome, amiable, and wealthy young man who leases Netherfield Park with hopes of purchasing it. Though genial and well-mannered, he is easily influenced by his friend Mr. Darcy and his sister's opinion, which leads to the disruption of his romance with Jane Bennet. He inherited a fortune of £100,006. Caroline Bingley the snobbish sister of Charles Bingley, with a fortune of £200,000. She harbours designs on Mr. Darcy and is jealous of his growing attachment to Elizabeth. She also disapproves of her brother's admiration for Jane Bennet and is disdainful of Meryton society, driven by her vanity and desire for social elevation. George Wickham Wickham is a charming but reprehensible cad. He has been acquainted with Mr. Darcy since infancy, being the son of Mr. Darcy's father's steward. An officer in the militia, he is superficially charming and rapidly forms an attachment with Elizabeth Bennet. He later runs off with Lydia with no intention of marriage, which would have resulted in her and her family's complete disgrace, but for Darcy's intervention to bribe Wickham to marry her by paying off his immediate debts. Mr. William Collins Mr. Collins is Mr. Bennet's distant second cousin, a clergyman, and the current heir presumptive to his estate of Longbourn House. He is an obsequious and pompous man, prone to making long and tedious speeches, who is excessively devoted to his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh the overbearing aunt of Mr. Darcy. Lady Catherine is the wealthy owner of Rosings Park, where she resides with her daughter Anne and is fawned upon by her rector, Mr. Collins. She is haughty, pompous, domineering, and condescending and has long planned to marry off her sickly daughter to Darcy to unite their two great estates, claiming it to be the dearest wish of both her and her late sister, Lady Anne Darcy, N.A. Copyright E. Fitzwilliam. Mr. Edward Gardner and Mrs. Gardner Edward Gardner is Mrs. Bennet's brother and a successful tradesman of sensible and gentlemanly character. Aunt Gardner is genteel and elegant and is close to her nieces Jane and Elizabeth. The Gardners are the parents of 4 children. They are instrumental in bringing about the marriage between Darcy and Elizabeth. Georgiana Darcy Georgiana is Mr. Darcy's quiet, amiable, and shy younger sister, with a dowry of £300,000, and is 16 when the story begins. When still 15, Miss Darcy almost eloped with Mr. Wickham but was saved by her brother, whom she idolizes. Thanks to years of tutelage under masters, she is accomplished at the piano, singing, playing the harp, drawing, and modern languages and is therefore described as Caroline Bingley's idea of an accomplished woman. Charlotte Lucas Elizabeth's 27-year-old friend. She marries Mr. Collins for financial security, fearing becoming a burden to her family. Austen uses Charlotte's decision to illustrate how women of the time often married out of convenience rather than love, without condemning her choice. 7. Charlotte is the daughter of Sir William Lucas and Lady Lucas, neighbours of the Bennet family. Colonel Fitzwilliam Colonel Fitzwilliam is the younger son of an earl and the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy. This makes him the cousin of Anne de Bourgh and the Darcy siblings, Fitzwilliam and Georgiana. He is about 30 years old at the beginning of the novel. He is the co-guardian of Miss Georgiana Darcy, along with his cousin, Mr. Darcy. According to Colonel Fitzwilliam, as a younger son, he cannot marry without thought to his prospective bride's dowry. Diagram showing relationships among the principal characters of Pride and Prejudice. Major themes. Many critics take the title as the start when analyzing the themes of Pride and Prejudice, but Robert Fox cautions against reading too much into the title, which was initially first impressions, because commercial factors may have played a role in its selection. After the success of Sense and Sensibility, nothing would have seemed more natural than to bring out another novel of the same author using again the formula of antithesis and alliteration for the title. The qualities of the title are not exclusively assigned to one or the other of the protagonists. Both Elizabeth and Darcy display Pride and Prejudice. 8. The phrase Pride and Prejudice had been used over the preceding 2 centuries by Joseph Hall, Jeremy Taylor, Joseph Addison, and Samuel Johnson. 9-10 Austen is thought to have taken her title from a passage in Fanny Burney's Cecilia, 1782, a novel she is known to have admired. The whole of this unfortunate business, said Dr. Lister, has been the result of Pride and Prejudice. If to Pride and Prejudice you owe your miseries, so wonderfully is good and evil balanced, that to Pride and Prejudice you will also owe their termination. 10-11, Capitalization as in the original. A theme in much of Austen's work is the importance of environment and upbringing in developing young people's character and morality. 12 Social standing and wealth are not necessarily advantages in her works, and a further theme common to Austen's work is ineffectual parents. In Pride and Prejudice, the failure of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet as parents is blamed for Lydia's lack of moral judgment. Darcy has been taught to be principled and scrupulously honorable, but he is also proud and overbearing. 12 Kitty, rescued from Lydia's bad influence and spending more time with her older sisters after they marry, is said to improve greatly in their superior society. 13. The American novelist Anna Quindlen observed in an introduction to an edition of Austen's novel in 1995. Pride and Prejudice is also about that thing that all great novels consider, the search for self. And it is the first great novel that teaches us this search is as surely undertaken in the drawing room making small talk as in the pursuit of a great white whale or the public punishment of adultery. 14. Marriage. Main article, Marriage in the Works of Jane Austen. The opening line of the novel announces, "It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." 15. This sets marriage as a motif and a central idea in the novel. Readers are poised to question whether or not these single men need a wife, or if the need is dictated by the neighborhood families and their daughters who require a good fortune. According to American Book Review, the opening line of Pride and Prejudice is considered second on their list of top 100 greatest opening lines in English literature, behind only "Call Me Ishmael" from Moby Dick. Marriage is a complex social activity that takes political and financial economy into account. In the case of Charlotte Lucas, the seeming success of her marriage lies in the comfortable financial circumstances of their household, while the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet serves to illustrate bad marriages based on an initial attraction and surface over substance, economic and psychological. The Bennets' marriage is an example that the youngest Bennet, Lydia, reenacts with Wickham, and the results are far from felicitous. Although the central characters, Elizabeth and Darcy, begin the novel as hostile acquaintances and unlikely friends, they eventually work toward a better understanding of themselves and each other, which frees them to truly fall in love. This does not eliminate the challenges of the real differences in their technically equivalent social status as gentry and their female relations. It does, however, provide them with a better understanding of each other's point of view from the different ends of the rather wide scale of differences within that category. When Elizabeth rejects Darcy's first proposal, the argument of marrying for love is introduced. Elizabeth accepts Darcy's proposal only when she is certain she loves him and her feelings are reciprocated. 16. Austen's complex sketching of different marriages ultimately allows readers to question what forms of alliance are desirable, especially when it comes to privileging economic, sexual, or companionate attraction. 17. Wealth. Money plays a fundamental role in the marriage market. for the young ladies seeking a well-off husband and for men who wish to marry a woman of means. George Wickham tries to elope with Georgiana Darcy, and Colonel Fitzwilliam states that he will marry someone with wealth. Marrying a woman of a rich family also ensured a linkage to a higher class family, as is visible in the desires of Bingley's sisters to have their brother married to Georgiana Darcy. Mrs. Bennet is frequently seen encouraging her daughters to marry a wealthy man of high social class. In Chapter 1, when Mr. Bingley arrives, she declares, "I am thinking of his marrying one of them." 18. Inheritance was by descent but could be further restricted by entailment, which in the case of the Longbourn estate restricted inheritance to male heirs only. In the case of the Bennet family, Mr. Collins was to inherit the family estate upon Mr. Bennet's death in the absence of any closer male heirs, and his proposal to Elizabeth would have ensured her security, but she refuses his offer. Inheritance laws benefited males because married women did not have independent legal rights until the second half of the 19th century. For the upper middle and aristocratic classes, marriage to a man with a reliable income was almost the only route to security for the woman and the children she was to have. 19. The irony of the opening line is that generally within this society it would be a woman who would be looking for a wealthy husband to have a prosperous life. 20. Class. Lady Catherine and Elizabeth by C. E. Brock, 1895. Lady Catherine confronts Elizabeth about Darcy, on the title page of the first illustrated edition. This is the other of the first two illustrations of the novel. Austen might be known now for her romances, but the marriages in her novels engage with economics and class distinction. Pride and Prejudice is hardly the exception. When Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, he cites their economic and social differences as an obstacle his excessive love has had to overcome, though he still anxiously harps on the problems it poses for him within his social circle. His aunt, Lady Catherine, later characterizes these differences in particularly harsh terms when she conveys what Elizabeth's marriage to Darcy will become: "Will the shades of Pemberley be thus polluted?" Although Elizabeth responds to Lady Catherine's accusations that hers is a potentially contaminating economic and social position, Elizabeth even insists she and Darcy, as gentleman's daughter and gentleman, are equals. Lady Catherine refuses to accept the possibility of Darcy's marriage to Elizabeth. However, as the novel closes, through curiosity to see how his wife conducted herself, Lady Catherine condescends to visit them at Pemberley. 21. The Bingleys present a particular problem for navigating class. Though Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst behave and speak of others as if they have always belonged in the upper echelons of society, Austen makes it clear that the Bingley fortunes stem from trade. The fact that Bingley rents Netherfield Hall €1 it is, after all, to let €1 distinguishes him significantly from Darcy, whose estate belonged to his father's family and who through his mother is the grandson and nephew of an earl. Bingley, unlike Darcy, does not own his property but has portable and growing wealth that makes him a good catch on the marriage market for poorer daughters of the gentry, like Jane Bennet, or of ambitious merchants. Class plays a central role in the evolution of the characters, and Jane Austen's radical approach to class is seen as the plot unfolds. 22. An undercurrent of the old Anglo-Norman upper class is hinted at in the story, as suggested by the names of Fitzwilliam Darcy and his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Fitzwilliam, Darcy, de Bourgh, Burke, and even Bennet, are traditional Norman surnames. 23. Self-knowledge. Through their interactions and their critiques of each other, Darcy and Elizabeth come to recognize their faults and work to correct them. Elizabeth meditates on her own mistakes thoroughly in Chapter 36. "How despicably have I acted," she cried, "I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities. Who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery! Yet, how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind. But vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away, where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself. 24. Other characters rarely exhibit this depth of understanding, or at least are not given the space within the novel for this sort of development. Tanner writes that Mrs. Bennet in particular, has a very limited view of the requirements of that performance. Lacking any introspective tendencies, she is incapable of appreciating the feelings of others and is only aware of material objects. 25 Mrs. Bennet's behavior reflects the society in which she lives, as she knows that her daughters will not succeed if they do not get married. The business of her life was to get her daughters married, its solace was visiting and news. 26 This shows that Mrs. Bennet is only aware of material objects and not of her feelings and emotions. 27. A notable exception is Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth Bennet's close friend and confidant. She accepts Mr. Collins's proposal of marriage once Lizzie rejects him, not out of sentiment but acute awareness of her circumstances as one of a large family. Charlotte's decision is reflective of her prudent nature and awareness. Style. Pride and Prejudice, like most of Austen's works, employs the narrative technique of free indirect speech, which has been defined as the free representation of a character's speech, by which one means, not words actually spoken by a character, but the words that typify the character's thoughts, or the way the character would think or speak, if she thought or spoke. 28. Austen creates her characters with fully developed personalities and unique voices. Though Darcy and Elizabeth are very alike, they are also considerably different. 29 By using narrative that adopts the tone and vocabulary of a particular character, in this case, Elizabeth, Austen invites the reader to follow events from Elizabeth's viewpoint, sharing her prejudices and misapprehensions. The learning curve, while undergone by both protagonists, is disclosed to us solely through Elizabeth's point of view, and her free indirect speech is essential, for it is through it that we remain caught, if not stuck, within Elizabeth's misprisions. 28. The few times the reader is allowed to gain further knowledge of another character's feelings, is through the letters exchanged in this novel. Darcy's first letter to Elizabeth is an example of this, as through his letter, the reader and Elizabeth are both given knowledge of Wickham's true character. Austen is known to use irony throughout the novel, especially from viewpoint of the character of Elizabeth Bennet. She conveys the oppressive rules of femininity that actually dominate her life and work, and are covered by her beautifully carved Trojan horse of ironic distance. 5. Beginning with a historical investigation of the development of a particular literary form and then transitioning into empirical verifications, it reveals free indirect discourse as a tool that emerged over time as practical means for addressing the physical distinctness of minds. Seen in this way, free indirect discourse is a distinctly literary response to an environmental concern, providing a scientific justification that does not reduce literature to a mechanical extension of biology, but takes its value to be its own original form. 30. Development of the novel. Page 2 of a letter from Jane Austen to her sister Cassandra, June 11, 1799, in which she first mentions Pride and Prejudice, using its working title First Impressions. Austen began writing the novel after staying at Goodnestone Park in Kent with her brother Edward and his wife in 1796. 31 It was originally titled First Impressions, and was written between October 1796 and August 1797. 32 On November 1, 1797, Austen's father sent a letter to London bookseller Thomas Caudill to ask if he had any interest in seeing the manuscript, but the offer was declined by return post. 33. The militia were mobilized after the French declaration of war on Britain in February 1793, and there was initially a lack of barracks for all the militia regiments, requiring the militia to set up huge camps in the countryside, which the novel refers to several times. 34:A-57A The Brighton camp, for which the militia regiment leaves in May after spending the winter in Meryton, was opened in August 1793, and the barracks for all the regiments of the militia were completed by 1796, placing the events of the novel between 1793 and 1795. 34:A-56A-57A. Austen made significant revisions to the manuscript for first impressions between 1811 and 1812. 32 As nothing remains of the original manuscript, study of the first drafts of the novel is reduced to conjecture. From the large number of letters in the final novel, it is assumed that First Impressions was an epistolary novel. 35. She later renamed the story Pride and Prejudice around 1811/1812, when she sold the rights to publish the manuscript to Thomas Egerton for £11036, equivalent to £9,300 in 2023. In renaming the novel, Austen probably had in mind the sufferings and oppositions summarized in the final chapter of Fanny Burney's Cecilia, called Pride and Prejudice, where the phrase appears 3 times in block capitals 12. It is possible that the novel's original title was altered to avoid confusion with other works. In the years between the completion of First Impressions and its revision into Pride and Prejudice, 2 other works had been published under that name, a novel by Margaret Halford and a comedy by Horace Smith. 33. Publication history. Title page of a 1907 edition illustrated by C. E. Brock. Austen sold the copyright for the novel to Thomas Egerton from the Military Library, Whitehall, in exchange for £110. Austen had asked for £150. 37 This proved a costly decision. Austen had published Sense and Sensibility on a commission basis, whereby she indemnified the publisher against any losses and received any profits, less costs and the publisher's commission. Unaware that Sense and Sensibility would sell out its edition, making her £140, 33, she passed the copyright to Egerton for a one-off payment, meaning that all the risk, and all the profits, would be his. Jan Fergus has calculated that Egerton subsequently made around £450 from just the first 2 editions of the book. 38. Egerton published the first edition of Pride and Prejudice in 3 hardcover volumes on January 28, 1813. 39 It was advertised in the Morning Chronicle, priced at 18s. 32 favorable reviews saw this edition sold out, with the second edition published in October that year. A third edition was published in 1817. 37. Foreign language translations first appeared in 1813 in French. Subsequent translations were published in German, Danish, and Swedish. 40 Pride and Prejudice was first published in the United States in August 1832 as Elizabeth Bennet or Pride and Prejudice. 37 The novel was also included in Richard Bentley's standard novel series in 1833. R. W. Chapman's scholarly edition of Pride and Prejudice, first published in 1923, has become the standard edition on which many modern published versions of the novel are based. 37. The novel was originally published anonymously, as were all of Austen's novels. However, whereas her first published novel, Sense and Sensibility, was presented as being written by a lady, Pride and Prejudice was attributed to the author of Sense and Sensibility. This began to consolidate a conception of Austen as an author, albeit anonymously. Her subsequent novels were similarly attributed to the anonymous author of all her then published works. Reception. Main article, Reception History of Jane Austen. 19th century. The novel was well received, with 3 favorable reviews in the first months following publication. 38 Anne Isabella Milbanke, later to be the wife of Lord Byron, called it the fashionable novel. 38 Noted critic and reviewer George Henry Lewis declared that he would rather have written Pride and Prejudice, or Tom Jones, than any of the Waverley novels. 41 Throughout the 19th century, not all reviews of the work were positive. Charlotte Brontë, in a letter to Lewis, wrote that Pride and Prejudice was a disappointment, a carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden, with neat borders and delicate flowers, but no open country, no fresh air, no Blue Hill, no Bonnie Beck. 4142 Along with her, Mark Twain was overwhelmingly negative of the work. He stated, "Every time I read Pride and Prejudice I want to dig Austen up and beat her over the skull with her own shin bone." 43. Austen for her part thought the playfulness and epigrammaticism of Pride and Prejudice was excessive, complaining in a letter to her sister Cassandra in 1813 that the novel lacked shade and should have had a chapter of solemn specious nonsense, about something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott or the history of Bonaparte. Copyright. 44. Walter Scott wrote in his journal, "Read again and for the third time at least, Miss Austen's very finely written novel of Pride and Prejudice." 45. 20th century. You could not shock her more than she shocks me. Beside her Joyce seems innocent as grass. It makes me most uncomfortable to see an English spinster of the middle class describe the amorous effects of brass, reveal so frankly and with such sobriety the economic basis of society. W. H. Auden, 1937, on Austen. 41. The American scholar Claudia L. Johnson defended the novel from the criticism that it has an unrealistic fairy tale quality. 46. One critic, Mary Poovey, wrote that the romantic conclusion of Pride and Prejudice is an attempt to hedge the conflict between the individualistic perspective inherent in the bourgeois value system and the authoritarian hierarchy retained from traditional, paternalistic society. 46. Johnson wrote that Austen's view of a power structure capable of reformation was not an escape from conflict. 46. Johnson wrote the outrageous unconventionality of Elizabeth Bennet was in Austen's own time very daring, especially given the strict censorship that was imposed in Britain by the Prime Minister, William Pitt, in the 1790s when Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice. 46. In the early 20th century, the term Collins, named for Austen's William Collins, came into use as slang for a thank you note to a host. 47. 48. 21st century. In 2003 the BBC conducted a poll for the UK's best-loved book in which Pride and Prejudice came second, behind The Lord of the Rings. 49. In a 2008 survey of more than 15,000 Australian readers, Pride and Prejudice came first in a list of the 101 best books ever written. 50. The 200th anniversary of Pride and Prejudice on January 28, 2013 was celebrated around the globe by media networks such as The Huffington Post, The New York Times, and The Daily Telegraph, among others. 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57. Adaptations. Film, television, and theater. See also, Jane Austen in popular culture. Pride and Prejudice. Numerous screen adaptations have contributed in popularizing Pride and Prejudice. 58. The first television adaptation of the novel, written by Michael Berry, was produced in 1938 by the BBC. It is a lost television broadcast. 58. Some of the notable film versions include the 1940 Academy Award-winning film, starring Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier. 59, based in part on Helen Jerome's 1935 stage adaptation, and that of 2005, starring Keira Knightley, an Oscar-nominated performance, and Matthew McFadden. 60 television versions include two by the BBC, a 1980 version starring Elizabeth Garvey and David Rintoul and a 1995 version, starring Jennifer L. and Colin Firth. A stage version created by Helen Jerome premiered at the Music Box Theatre in New York in 1935, starring Adrienne Allen and Colin Keith Johnston, and opened at the St. James's Theatre in London in 1936, starring Celia Johnson and Hugh Williams. Elizabeth Refuses, a play by Margaret McNamara of scenes from the novel, was made into a TV program by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in 1957. 61 First Impressions was a 1959 Broadway musical version starring Polly Bergen, Farley Granger, and Hermione Gingold. 62 In 1995, a musical concept album was written by Bernard J. Taylor, with Claire Moore in the role of Elizabeth Bennet and Peter Carey in the role of Mr. Darcy. 63 A new stage production, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The new musical was presented in concert on October 21, 2008 in Rochester, New York, with Colin Donnell as Darcy. 64 The Swedish composer Daniel Nelson based his 2011 opera Stolthet och Fardom on Pride and Prejudice. 65 Works inspired by the book include Bride and Prejudice and Trishna, 1985 Hindi TV series. The Lizzie Bennet Diaries which premiered on a dedicated YouTube channel on April 9, 2012. 66, and concluded on March 28, 2013. 67 is an Emmy Award-winning web series. 68 which recounts the story via vlogs recorded primarily by the Bennet sisters. 69 70 it was created by Hank Green and Bernie Suss. 71 In 2017, the bicentenary year of Austen's death, Pride and Prejudice an adaptation in words and music to music by Carl Davis from the 1995 film and text by Gil Hornby was performed in the UK, with Hayley Mills as the narrator. 72 This adaptation was presented in 2024 at the Sydney Opera House and the Arts Centre Melbourne, narrated by Nadine Garner. 73 In 2018, part of the storyline of the Brazilian soap opera Orgulho e Paixão, aired on TV Globo, was inspired by the book. The soap opera was also inspired by other works of Jane Austen. It features actors Nathalia Dill, Thiago Lacerda, Agatha Moreira, Rodrigo Simas, Gabriela Duarte, Marcelo Faria Pt, Alessandra Negrini, and Natalia Duvail. 74 Fire Island is a movie written by Joel Kim Booster that reimagines Pride and Prejudice as a gay drama set on the quintessential gay vacation destination of Fire Island. Booster describes the movie as an unapologetic and modern twist on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. 75 The movie was released in June 2022 and features a main cast of Asian American actors. Literature. Main article: List of literary adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. In Gwyn Creedy's comedic romance novel, Seducing Mr. Darcy, the heroine lands in Pride and Prejudice by way of magic massage, has a fling with Darcy and unknowingly changes the rest of the story. 76. Abigail Reynolds is the author of 7 Regency set variations on Pride and Prejudice. Her Pemberley Variations series includes Mr. Darcy's Obsession, To Conquer Mr. Darcy, What Would Mr. Darcy Do, and Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, The Last Man in the World. Her modern adaptation, The Man Who Loved Pride and Prejudice, is set on Cape Cod. 77. Bella Breen is the author of 9 variations on Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice and Poison, 4 Months to Wed, Forced to Marry, and the Rescue of Elizabeth Bennet. 78. In March 2009, Seth Grahame-Smith's Pride and Prejudice and Zombies takes Austen's work and mashes it up with zombie hordes, cannibalism, ninja, and ultra-violent mayhem. 79. In March 2010, Quirk Books published a prequel by Steve Hawken-Smith that deals with Elizabeth Bennet's early days as a zombie hunter. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, Dawn of the Dreadfuls. 80. The 2016 film of Grahame-Smith's adaptation was released starring Lily James, Sam Riley, and Matt Smith. Marvel has also published their take on this classic by releasing a short comic series of 5 issues that stays true to the original storyline. The first issue was published on April 1, 2009 and was written by Nancy Hagesky. 81. It was published as a graphic novel in 2010 with artwork by Hugo Petrus. Pamela Aedon is the author of a trilogy of books telling the story of Pride and Prejudice from Mr. Darcy's point of view, Fitzwilliam Darcy, Gentleman. The books are an assembly such as this 82, Duty and Desire 83, and these three remain 84. Detective novel author P.D. James has written a book titled Death Comes to Pemberley, which is a murder mystery set 6 years after Elizabeth and Darcy's marriage 85. Sandra Lerner's sequel to Pride and Prejudice, Second Impressions, develops the story and imagined what might have happened to the original novel's characters. It is written in the style of Austen after extensive research into the period and language and published in 2011 under the pen name of Ava Farmer 86. Joe Baker's best-selling 2013 novel Longbourn imagines the lives of the servants of Pride and Prejudice 87. A cinematic adaptation of Longbourn was due to start filming in late 2018, directed by Sharon Maguire, who also directed Bridget Jones's Diary and Bridget Jones's Baby, screenplay by Jessica Swale, produced by Random House Films and Studio Canal 88. The novel was also adapted for radio, appearing on BBC Radio 4's Book at Bedtime, abridged by Sarah Davies and read by Sophie Thompson. It was first broadcast in May 2014, and again on Radio 4 Extra in September 2018-89. In the novel Eligible, Curtis Sittenfeld sets the characters of Pride and Prejudice in modern-day Cincinnati, where the Bennet parents, erstwhile Cincinnati social climbers, have fallen on hard times. Elizabeth, a successful and independent New York journalist, and her single older sister Jane must intervene to salvage the family's financial situation and get their unemployed adult sisters to move out of the house and onward in life. In the process they encounter Chip Bingley, a young doctor and reluctant reality TV celebrity, and his medical school classmate, Fitzwilliam Darcy, a cynical neurosurgeon. 1991. Pride and Prejudice has also inspired works of scientific writing. In 2010, scientists named a pheromone identified in male mouse urine Darcin 92 after Mr. Darcy, because it strongly attracted females. In 2016, a scientific paper published in the Journal of Inherited Metabolic Disease speculated that Mrs. Bennet may have been a carrier of a rare genetic disease, explaining why the Bennets didn't have any sons, and why some of the Bennet sisters are so silly. 93. In summer 2014, Uden Entertainment's Manga Classics line published a manga adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. There's a lot to like, but the film has one distinct disadvantage. Back in 1995, the definitive version of Pride and Prejudice was brought out, and everyone I know who saw that one agrees with me that it is simply the best. Much of it is the acting. Having Colin Firth as Darcy isn't bad, but the biggest reason to adore the made-for-TV version is that it's long, very, very long. This allows the story to unfold slowly and is never rushed. Unfortunately, every movie version I've seen is just too rushed, and it's hard to shove this wonderful story into a 2-hour time slot. So, no matter how good the 2005 movie is, and it's quite good, it cannot hope to equal the miniseries. It's a shame, actually, as there's so much to like about this Keira Knightley version. The music is great, the locations top-notch, and the Bennet girls actually look their proper ages. For example, in the 1940 MGM version, the actual ages of the actresses was their mid-20s to almost 40. And, the Bennets are supposed to be teenagers, thereabout. My advice is go ahead and watch this 2005 film, it's really very lovely. But then do yourself a favor, find the 1995 version. You'll be thankful, believe me. Handsomely filmed adaptation of a beautiful book. The book by the wonderful Jane Austen is definitely better than the film, dealing with the consequences of love, and the social differences of the late 18th century. The film is certainly handsome looking, with some truly beautiful locations and costumes, with a nice script and some excellent performances from Keira Knightley as Lizzie and in particular Judi Dench as Lady Catherine. Donald Sutherland, yeah, you saw right, was quite charming as Mr. Bennet if you put his awkward accent aside. I liked Matthew McFadden as Mr. Darcy, with his handsome looks and all that, but I will say I do prefer Colin Firth's interpretation from the sublime 1995 miniseries. Firth seemed to adopt a more likable and sympathetic approach to the character. I liked the way the film dealt with the period look and the social differences, and while there was a lot of the pride, I would have liked to have seen a little more of the prejudice. If anything, the film could have done with being 20 minutes longer, as I felt there wasn't quite enough content from the book. Then again, it's been a long time since I read it, so I could be wrong. Overall, a beautiful film, not quite as good as the 1995 film Sense and Sensibility with Kate Winslet and Emma Thompson, but worth watching for the detail that obviously took a lot of effort to get right. 8.5/10 Bethany Cox. Brilliance took 2 decades to arrive. Before I start, I would like to say this. I can read, have read the book, and I read the title of the movie before watching, as should you all. Quite disappointed in all the pompous idiots filled with prejudice about the movie. I know that another version of the well-mined Jane Austen classic would need to be brilliant indeed. Such diverse and beautifully written characters and such a delightful plot, so deeply rooted in a profound understanding of human nature, are timelessly attractive to directors, actors, and audiences alike. So give them a break. You couldn't do any better. Let's start with Mr. Darcy. Darcy's embodied by Olivier, Firth, and now Matthew McFadyen bring differently significance to enjoy in the proud and socially awkward leading male role. Where Olivier and Firth gave us an aloof, arrogant Darcy encased rigidly in a shell so impenetrable it was almost impossible to believe he had been moved by Lizzie's sardonic criticisms or attracted by her spirited independence, McFadyen shows a more accessible Darcy. He's vulnerable, even fragile behind his stiff manners. His aloofness is more believably from social inadequacy than arrogance, yet he is believably constrained by his social standing to regard decorum, fortune, and propriety in a wife's family as significant in his choice of a bride. His capitulation to Lizzie is therefore more believable. Similarly, Garson, L., and Keira Knightley illustrate the lively intelligence, sharp-minded wit and wry humor of Elizabeth Bennet in equally shining ways that nevertheless bring out different aspects of the character. Keira Knightley's performance as Elizabeth Bennet is by far her best, as she sparkles in this role. The two have a chemistry that I had yet to see on the big or small screen, one that mirrors real-life romances. The dislike on both accounts is obvious. Watching it grow to love was beautiful and stunning. The love story is heartfelt and sweetly, deeply affecting to a level that modern romantic comedies rarely achieve. I found this movie to be a richly photographed, memorable ensemble production in which the romance is predominant over the drama but does not eclipse it. Though my one disappointment, the ending. Of course I wanted to see them kiss, who didn't? But the shots of them arguing in the rain, and as they draw close with the sunlight shining between them was breathtaking. Giving due significance to the rural environment which plays such an important part in the story, the cinematography captures wide frames of soft, misty fields, copses and winding country roads as an environment which underscores the gentle manners and passionately beating hearts beneath empire gowns and ruffled shirts. The surroundings both detract from the humans and function as appropriately natural settings for the dramas of human nature. Keira Knightley's swan-like Elizabeth moves with energy and grace, hotly opinionated and profoundly moved by principles and prejudices, and magnetically drawn by the seeming arrogance, reticence, and gallant behavior, finally revealed, of Mr. Darcy. For 2 centuries Elizabeth Bennet has been a heroine much admired for her self-contained independence within a culture more conditioned to female submissiveness. Knightley's portrayal is true to the original. All in all, I must give this movie 5 stars, 10 out of 10, 100% brilliance. The story itself, the characters, the actors, everything that was in the movie bewitched me body and soul. I have never been more moved by a movie, especially not one where I found it to be as hilarious as it was moving. Jane Austen forever. Jane Austen's tale of love and economics reaches us once more with the energy of a thorough novelty. Pride and Prejudice has been a favorite novel of mine since I first read it, and I've seen Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson, Colin Firth and Jennifer L. and now Matthew Macfadyen and Keira Knightley. Amazingly enough, I've never been disappointed. The material seems to be foolproof. Colin Firth's Darcy, in many ways, is the Darcy I've always imagined. He's been an actor I've followed feverishly since his glorious Adrian Leduc in Apartment Zero. Matthew Macfadyen was totally new to me, but he managed to create that sense of longing that makes that final payoff so satisfying. Keira Knightley is a ravishing revelation. I must confess, I didn't remotely imagine that she was capable of the powerful range she brilliantly shows here. The other big surprise is Joe Wright, the director, in his feature film debut, which is more than promising. It's extraordinary. The photography, the art direction and the spectacular supporting cast, in particular Donald Sutherland and Brenda Blethyn, makes this new version of a perennial classic a memorable evening at the movies. Exquisitely filmed. Pride and Prejudice has always been one of my favorite books, so any screen incarnation has to live up to certain personal expectations of character, style, etc. And of course, there is the gold standard of the 1995 BBC series, which, as other reviewers have pointed out, had the luxury of several episodes to cover a story that here takes just 2 hours. So I was truly delighted to enjoy this movie so much. It had a lot to live up to. The first thing I must say is that it is exquisitely photographed. The atmosphere set by the beautiful cinematography is perfect. The film deserves to be nominated for an Oscar on that basis alone. I am in awe of the technical crew and director who could find such unspoiled vistas and such perfect weather in England, and I say that as a Brit who used to live very close to some of the Eastern England locations. I sat right through to the end of the credits to see where it was shot, because I assumed it must have been filmed in some remote, rural, continental European locale. I felt quite ashamed that I had doubted the ability of my native land to still provide such delightful scenery. The mist rising off early morning fields, geese on a perfect farm pond, magnificent country estates and enormous trees more usually associated with California than England. Also perfect were the interiors. The air of genteel poverty in which the Bennets lived was well captured. The slightly down-at-heel scruffiness of the Bennets' farm and house, and the general dirtiness of 18th-century life for most people, contrasted well with the ridiculous, rich fussiness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh's house and the stark, museum-like beauty of Darcy's home. The cast were excellent. I thought Rosamund Pike as Jane Bennet was perfect. Simon Woods as Mr. Bingley was charming, although perhaps a little too puppyish. I enjoyed Donald Sutherland and Brenda Blethyn as MR and MRS Bennet, and I'm one who thinks Matthew Macfadyen did a very good job as Mr. Darcy, a characterization which was slightly more user-friendly than Colin Firth's 1995 Darcy. Also outstanding were Claudie Blakely as plain Charlotte Lucas, rescued from a life of unmarried oblivion by pompous Mr. Collins, a very good Tom Hollander, and Kelly Riley, as the bitcha Miss Bingley. Is Rupert Friend, Mr. Wickham, destined to play Orlando Bloom's brother? Am I alone in seeing a similarity? Of course, Keira Knightley plays the title role of Elizabeth. I have followed her career closely since Bend It Like Beckham, and I thought this easily her best acting performance so far. She captured the playfulness and wit of Lizzie's bright mind wonderfully well, and made me think long and hard how truly frustrating it must have been to be an intelligent young woman in a world that expected nothing more of her than an ability to choose ribbon and to capture a husband possessed of money. The only possible slight criticism I might make is that Keira Knightley is perhaps a little too waif-like to pull off the 18th century characterization entirely convincingly. She is stunningly beautiful, but her stick-thin appearance alongside her more robust-looking screen sisters made her look as if Mr. Bennet might well have doubted her parentage. Spirited modern interpretation of Austen's classic love story. A modernized version of Jane Austen's classic novel that should not be compared unfavorably with 1940 Hollywood Olivier/Garson version nor several BBC serials, culminating in the most acclaimed TV series version from 1995 with Colin Firth and Jennifer L. a personal favorite. This 2005 film clocks in 127 minutes, UK/Europe, and 135 minutes, USA and Canada, the extended version allowing audiences to share more of the timeless love story with the main characters Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Director Joe Wright plus his screenwriters, Oscar winner Emma Thompson contributed to the final screenplay, have chosen to emphasize Elizabeth Bennet/Mr. Darcy plus Jane Bennet/Mr. Bingley storylines and reduce Mr. Wickman, Charlotte and Mr. Collins to supporting characters. Austen's famous wit, satire and humor that forms the basis for her enduring appeal, Pride and Prejudice, was finally published in 1813 and continues as an annual bestseller, is sidelined to open up this version as more emotional drama for modern audiences. If you are open to a newer interpretation, can avoid comparisons to the nearly 5-hour 1995 TV version, which allowed for greater depth and detail in telling all the characters' storylines and accepts some of the new film's rushed storylines, you are in for a treat. New British star Keira Knightley, Elizabeth Bennet, excels in her first real leading actress role, ably supported by fellow Brit Rosamund Pike, Jane Bennet, as the sisters supportive of each other's and their Bennet family problems. Knightley at 20 is the right age for her character. This allows Elizabeth's girlish personality plus her character's pride, misjudgments and loving nature to shine through. Great star turns from Brenda Blethyn as their mother Mrs. Bennet plus Oscar winner Judi Dench as fearsome Lady de Bourgh, Mr. Darcy's aunt, add depth to this film version. Claudie Blakely as Elizabeth's wise friend Charlotte Lucas and Simon Wood's amusing Mr. Bingley are delightful supporting performers. One major surprise is Canadian actor Donald Sutherland's touching performance as Mr. Bennet, capturing both the humor of living in an all-female household and 5 daughters to look after with the poignancy of seeing his eldest children's difficult relationships develop. Easily his best acting performance in years. In the difficult role of Mr. Darcy, rising British star Matthew Macfadyen, BBC's spy series Spooks and award-winning New Zealand film In My Father's Den rises to the occasion. With the short running time, there is not enough time to allow Darcy's repressed and prejudiced personality to be fully represented. Macfadyen perfectly displays Darcy's social and class problems, his unfortunate attempts at gaining Elizabeth Bennet's interest and his painful adjustments to achieve their personal love story. Macfadyen and Knightley's objectionable first dance, their embarrassingly moving Collins house meeting, the unexpected Pemberley encounter plus their 2 proposal scenes are highlights of this film. Engaging acting performances with wondrous film photography, film locations at some of United Kingdom's most famous stately homes, marvelous film sets and costumes plus one of 2005's best original music scores add greatly to this new film version. All in all, one of the better films of 2005. Not perfect filmmaking and not intended to be as subtle as Austen's novel, but a wonderful surprise with some changes to present a modern version of Pride and Prejudice for current audiences. Do see this film as and when it is released worldwide. And after seeing the film or revisiting 1995 BBC TV series, read the original novel for its classic storyline, memorable characters and Austen's brilliant writing style, wit and humor. 9 out of 10 for this different interpretation of an enduring classic. Still trying to make up my mind. Spoiler: I don't immediately think this is my favorite interpretation of Jane Austen's novel, but I do not hate it either. The look is good, rustic England, but the Bennets' home seems a little farmy. The assembly room, I assume that to be the setting for the first ball, does have a good atmosphere, though noisy, rowdy, informal, fun English country dancing. Not in the Maypole and Morris dancers sense. The type of dancing favored at this time was actually known as English country dance. A tiny point I noticed is how of the period the windows at the Collins parsonage look. The one jarring thing was that blue, white, and orange ceiling at Pemberley, surrounded by the other decor. It seemed tacky in such a grand house. The wardrobe department doesn't give an impression of any kind of coordination. The dress Lizzie wears to the first ball isn't dressy enough to say balls and such functions were a chance for the unmarried to meet potential partners. She looks like she should be gardening in it. The Netherfield ball is odd. Caroline Bingley wearing an unusual sleeveless number and Lizzie without gloves, where every other lady, even the extras, is in both gloves and sleeved dresses. Saying that, the striking costume difference when they first arrive at the ball marks them out instantly as high-fashion people compared to the locals, but their entrance is possibly too dramatic. Jane looks pretty, but Lizzie seems to have coiled her hair, stuck a few hairpins in and hoped for the best. Mary is plain enough to melt into the background, but the family looks mixed when Bingley returns to visit Longbourn. Jane is dressed up, Kitty and Lizzie are middling, and Mary looks like she should be scrubbing the steps. The Lizzie I envisage doesn't listen at doors to her parents talking. Lydia and Kitty maybe, but not Lizzie, but she is kind, i.e. trying to get Jane the carriage to visit Netherfield. Jane listening at the door with her sisters during Mr. Collins' proposal also seems out of character, quite an extroverted action for someone described by Charlotte Lucas as not affectionate enough with Bingley. I missed the absence of Lizzie giving a clear indication after Wickham and Lydia are married that she knows that the story he spun her had a few holes in it. None of Austen's witty satire on Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's incompatibility is present. I also missed Mr. Bennet's dry wit. He sounds so laid back, almost half asleep in some scenes. Although she looks desperate pushing her daughters under Bingley and Darcy's noses as soon as they arrive, Mrs. Bennet obviously cares about their futures, although not shrieky as in the 1995 adaptation. You can see why Darcy finds her behavior vulgar. When Mr. Collins discreetly asks to speak to Lizzie, as with Bingley and Jane, her haste to clear the room seems like overkill. Incidentally, why go to the kitchen in the latter scene? Surely they had another good room to sit in. Lydia and Kitty having their hair down adds to their youthful look. They both look about 14, so it seems odd when Kitty states that she is older by 2 years. I'm not sure why Mary wears so much black and grey. Is she in mourning? Her tears at Netherfield after her piano performance isn't very Mary-like. I always thought of her as vain enough to think herself brilliant. There is a nice montage of them all showing themselves up at Netherfield. In a film, time is of the essence, and this is an effective way to show a lot in a very short moment. My crucial issue with the script and dialogue is that, while it is well crafted from Austen's source material, it seems rushed. Darcy, who, incidentally, didn't strike me as handsome, speaks in a rude, clipped, unfriendly way even when surrounded by friends. The Bennet's maid sounds like she's reading her line, although I liked the contrast of this young girl laying out shoes and dresses for girls her own age to attend the Netherfield ball, an occasion she would never be grand enough to attend. It was sad and poignant somehow, and the Bingley footman's Miss Bennet introduction sounds silly. I'm sure Mrs. Bennet and her daughters would have sufficed. At Rosings, Lizzie and Lady Catherine seem to be reading their lines. Lady Catherine's confrontation with Lizzie regarding Darcy's proposal is also rushed. It's like the film crew only had 5 minutes of time free in the schedule before lunch to film it. Lizzie's snappy response to her family afterwards is not in keeping with the character Keira Knightley has shown this far, more sulky teenager than witty female. When Darcy first proposes, I think they were hurrying through the script to get out of the rain. They did include many brilliant lines from the book. I especially liked Mr. Collins turning his inquiry about which cousin was responsible for the food into a kind of backhanded compliment by being pleased that the estate can generate enough to afford servants. The only downside is his voice. The violence of his affection for Lizzie described in a monotone was ironic. One small thing I'm not certain of, Why is the travelling in this film often done at night? Lady Catherine visits Longbourn at night, Lizzie and the gardeners come home from Derbyshire at night. Do the filmmakers realize that this was still an era when highwaymen were lurking around at night? I like what the filmmakers were trying to do, I just can't make up my mind as to whether they achieved it. A splendid and moving period piece. Spoiler. I saw this movie for the first time on a premium channel, and bought the DVD shortly after. I also can't pass it up any time it's repeated on cable. I'll look forward the whole day to watching some program or another, but if I see that this movie is on, I'll forsake almost any other program for it. Though I've seen many cinematic interpretations of her work, I must confess that I've never read any Jane Austen. I generally have trouble plodding through the language from books published from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I just tend not to have the patience for it. Anyway, I've finally, after watching this version of Pride and Prejudice for perhaps the 15th time in less than 3 months, felt compelled to share with you my tremendous love for the story, and I think, when I'm done here, that I'll go to my favorite bookstore's website and buy some of Ms. Austen's work. Actually, I couldn't wait that long, I just paused from writing this to place an order for the literary Pride and Prejudice. The cinematography of this movie is fantastic, the locations very stirring, and the script brilliant, really lending itself to the actors' abilities to realistically interpret it with incredible depth and color. But the director, Joe Wright, deserves extra special commendation for getting such wonderful work from the actors, especially Keira Knightley. Yeah, sure, she was great in Bend It Like Beckham and the Pirates trilogy, but I really didn't think she had it in her to lead a cast, much less a cast with Donald Sutherland and the mighty Dame Judy. But she really did prove me wrong. Much like Rachel Weisz did in The Constant Gardener. Keira did a fantastic job. Mind-numbingly so. Kind of scary that this is the same young lady that did Domino. Matthew Macfadyen stormed into my world with a delicate grace that suggested a deep abiding talent with which I should further acquaint myself. I hadn't been aware of him before I saw this movie. The way he and Keira traded their characters' individual pride and prejudice, they both suffered from large measures of both, was a magic dance. I can't say with any certainty right now that I've seen a portrayal of two such lovers done better. What Macfadyen really did for me with Darcy was the sublime nuance of his expression. Though his face really didn't change much at all, whether he was stuffy, indignant, or angry, when I first saw that dazed look and tentative smile of devout worship on his face when Elizabeth was about to have that profound, private audience with her father toward the end of the movie, it was wonderful. I could really feel Darcy losing himself in his love for Elizabeth, and I could feel almost as strongly his relief at not having to fight it anymore. The stoic, starchy, intimidating Darcy has been reduced to a fumbling child. I thought it was the truly naked face of the character madly hinted at, but so well hidden before just then. Bewitching. Every well-fleshed portrayal in this movie was done really well. It will be the actors from this movie that I picture when I read and reread the book, but I must make a point of saying that Tom Hollander's Mr. Collins is brilliantly pathetic. Mr. Bennet was truly one of Donald Sutherland's greatest roles, and it was a great thrill to see the Dame Judy's Lady Catherine put in her place when she made that late-night visit to see Elizabeth. I now understand that the story of Darcy and Elizabeth is one of the greatest love stories of all time, and it's one of those grand love stories that retains its delicacy without being smarmy or ridiculous. I treasure the privilege of being allowed access to this interpretation of Pride and Prejudice, and I'll recommend it to anybody. It's destined to become a legend. Watch this movie. You'll be glad you did. Romantic, funny, well acted, well scripted, give it a try. Spoiler. Having watched a slew of special effects-laden trailers before this film, I was reassured to discover that in the brave new world of CGI cinema there is still a place for a satisfyingly romantic story, well acted and thoughtfully scripted and directed. Comparisons with the highly regarded 1995 BBC series are inevitable, but whereas that production had the luxury of time to unfold its plot and characters at leisure, the creators of this film had the unenviable task of reducing Jane Austen's book to just 2 hours. Yes, Austen lovers will mourn the absence or alteration of favorite scenes. Yes, we do lose some sense of the developing and changing relationships between the main characters. 2 examples, Wickham appears in only 2 scenes of any significance, and personally I would have liked more time to savor Lizzie and Darcy's rediscovery of one another at Pemberley. Yes, there is occasionally a feeling of entering or leaving a scene partway through. Where do Lizzie's uncle and aunt think she has gone when she apparently sets off from Pemberley to walk to Lambton without a word to them? On the whole though, I think director Joe Wright, and screenwriter Deborah Mogake, are successful in retaining the flavor, the vital essence of Austen's original. The film also offers some new perspectives on very familiar characters. Tom Hollander in particular, gives Mr. Collins something approaching dignity in his determined but usually unsuccessful attempts to ingratiate himself with those more powerful than him, and he provides some of the funniest moments of the film. Witness his attempts to gain Mr. Darcy's attention at the ball. Mrs. Bennet too, who we all remember Alison Steadman playing with an enthusiasm approaching pantomime, is more sympathetic in the hands of Brenda Bleathen because we understand more clearly the reasons behind her desperation to marry her daughters off. Mr. Bingley though teeters a fine line between nervous hesitancy and simple-minded idiocy, which made me question why Jane Bennet would ever consider marrying him. And who on earth thought of giving him Cameron Diaz's infamous "There's Something About Mary" hairdo? Reviews for Matthew Macfadyen seem to have been mixed so far, the inevitable Firth factor at least part of the reason. Personally I think he has a sexy, brooding presence to equal Firth's, and, dare I say it, his Darcy has a little more charm and humanity when he does let his guard down. The scene where he bursts in upon Lizzie at the Collins parsonage, all glove-twisting nervousness and incoherent attempts at small talk, captures perfectly the bewilderment of a man trained since childhood not to express his feelings, and made vulnerable for the first time by the conflicting emotions Lizzie has stirred in him. I do think his Darcy is oddly lacking in pride though, his taciturnity attributed to having so many expectations to live up to that he never dares let down the facade of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley. Nor do we get any sense, as in the book, that Lizzie's free-spirited influence alters his attitude or behavior towards others. The explanation the audience is left with being that really he was a nice guy all along, just misunderstood. Keira Knightley's Lizzie brings nothing really new to the part, but whilst too stunningly beautiful to be the girl dismissed by Darcy as only tolerable, she has an abundance of the playfulness and charm which quickly captivates him. She is also a good enough actress to show Lizzie's own growing confusion and then loss as she realizes how she has misread her own feelings. The chemistry between the two leads works well, their dance at Netherfield a key moment as their verbal sparring gives way to a growing physical awareness which neither of them is ready to admit. Other little incidents such as the touch of hands as Darcy helps Lizzie into her carriage keep the romance heating up, and it almost reaches boiling point in the first proposal scene. It does fizzle away disappointingly though in their final reconciliation, which promises much at the start with a heady mix of very slightly disarrayed nightwear, rolling thunder, and smoldering gazes across a misty meadow, but, whilst tenderly played, it ends up being a little too coy for the 21st century. Come on Joe Wright, give us a kiss in the DVD version please. A timeless adaptation of a timeless Jane Austen novel. The fantastic romantic world of Jane Austen again makes its way to the silver screen in Joe Wright's new adaptation of the classic novel Pride and Prejudice. It is the first feature film to be adapted from it in 65 years, and believe me when I say it does not disappoint. This adaptation is, for lack of a better word, a brilliant achievement that keeps you actively involved from the first scene to the very last scene, just about consuming you with aching romance, and it is sprinkled with humor and intelligence. still taking place in the late 1700s and still interweaving its story with timeless emotion, pride, narrow-mindedness, and love. Pride and Prejudice, 2005, zooms in on the Bennet household in class-conscious, stuck-up England. In this household, we follow five spirited sisters under the idealism of their overbearing mother, a superbly neurotic Brenda Bleethland providing for the comic relief, who desperately wants them all to marry and thereby secure the future of the family estate. But the standout sister and protagonist in the film, Lizzie, Keira Knightley, is clever enough to have other ideas, but alas too romantic to carry them out. Sigh. When reviewing period films such as this one often focuses on the setting and costume design. I believe this is done because they are often better crafted than the actual story. But in Pride and Prejudice, 2005, the stormy emotions of its character saw bottled up but bubbling to get out a completely consume the entire film and places understated set designs in the back seat. Only when it was consciously put forward, like when Lizzie Bennet was admiring the beautiful architecture and Greek statues of Mr. Darcy's estate, did I ever notice the background and it was, of course, extraordinary. A similar state displaying the dynamics of its central cast should be attributed to the grand dancing scene between Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. The two are so absorbing that when Wright purposely fades out the rest of the dancing crowd, you do not notice a change. Your eyes are still solely Knightley and Macfadyen. It took me 3 viewings to realize this. As for acting performances then, the unspeakably lovely Keira Knightley has finally done it. She has proved me wrong with a truly Oscar-worthy performance, and she does it without crying, worrying, moping, and sighing like the other nominees that year. Knightley is in fact all about sweet subtlety here, bringing a fantastic presence to her high-spirited character Lizzie. She is the type of character that every girl and woman in the world can identify with, and with Knightley behind her to give her oomph, you will not find a more likable creature in films this year. Macfadyen is completely satisfactory as Lizzie's love interest Mr. Darcy, but he is no Colin Firth, lacking in charm and is a bit too wooden. But no matter, because these two have the best on-screen chemistry I have ever seen. I'm not kidding, this was sensational. Such magnetism. It is highlighted from scene 1, playfully touching upon their sexual tension and gradually turning it into feverish love that sends chills down your spine. Every last actor in the cast of Pride and Prejudice, 2005, gets to shine in their charactera, from Dame Judi Dench as a cold rich lady to Donald Sutherland as caring Mr. Bennet, all except Jenna Malone, whose all-too Valley Girl American attitude was distracting and annoyingly anachronistic. But it is Knightley who is in focus and who propels the film with her warm charisma. It is impossible not to fall in love with the main characters, and I say this as someone who avoids romance-themed films and who does not care for period films. This is a truly timeless story, and this film will hopefully be remembered, celebrated, and praised for breathing life into it with such passion. 10/10, which is a rare grade for me. Minor errors? But Pride was constipation, they forgot Prejudice. And Austen come to that. Spoiler. Well, Wright may have made a gritty depiction of life around 1800, as he so repeatedly and anally goes on about because of when it was written as opposed to published, but it is his, not Austen's, and shouldn't claim to be an adaptation. Mrs. Bennet looks like a rural washerwoman. This is a pampered woman, they have servants, remember the book scene with the servant dressing the hair, etc.? But Wright portrays her with rough reddened skin all down her chest, rough hands, and working in the kitchen. And the pigs wandering through. If he wants bucolic, he should try Tess. Mr. Bennet, the script makes too cuddly and modern and ignored the weakness in him. The scene where he stops Mary playing is supposed to make you cringe, not pass in seconds. If it doesn't, don't include it. Macfadyen is very weak in the part and seems to be doing some kind of Pride by numbers acting. The first proposal he looks like a nervous schoolboy rather than a man overcoming his pride to make a proposal beneath his station. Most of his lines, he could as well be reading a shopping list. Lydia is awful. Completely over the top with excessive shrieking and skipping. Indeed, Knightley plays Elizabeth more like the giggling inane character Lydia actually is in the book, at times. And Elizabeth. Half the time Knightley is, clearly, mimicking Elle's voice and intonation. Close your eyes to see what a copy it is. And in her role you see Wright's major error: there is no prejudice. From the first encounter with Darcy she clearly fancies him. When he comments to Bingley on the attractiveness of the women in the hall she initially looks hurt, not shocked and affronted. The latter should set up the prejudice side of things. And when she and Caroline are prancing round the room she comes across like a tease, obviously all over him. And by virtually cutting out Wickham you don't get Elizabeth invested enough there to set up the prejudicial aspects falling out of that relationship. And apparently it is Caroline, not Miss Bingley. And Mr. Bingley happily wanders into Jane's bedroom. And Wright can boast about how great he is with all he wants. But a few panorama shots of rural life, which show the preference for Hardy, don't excuse him the glaring blunders all over the place. The cinematographer, who clearly wants awards, should have been reined in. He veered between Bronte and Hardy throughout the film, and wasn't the last proposal shots / lighting from Tess? The need to see Darcy walk along through the scape with unkempt shirt was just dumb. But most importantly, when going between those two very different landscapes they forget the most important one, Austen. She'd have laughed out loud at the Elizabeth equals sad, therefore equals rain, running through to picturesque folly, wet Darcy rubbish. I admit I found it impossible to watch the film without using the book as context. I was prepared to give it some leeway as it had to provide the story in a short space of time. But to forget fully one half of the core of the book in Prejudice and Darcy to continually look more constipated than prideful, made it almost unwatchable. I could only see it as a mess with generally poor performances. When Knightley wasn't aping Elle she was gurning or skipping or both and only calmed down a couple of times to indicate she does have some promise, but faffing about on swings to convey emotion isn't a substitute for a poor script and poor direction, although for some it was simply a case of bad script. Tom Holland alone would escape censure. While he toned down the comic aspects of Collins, he did turn in a very interesting approach. Dench does superbly the shtick she can do in her sleep, whether it be here or in Oscar Wilde, but this was supposed to be Lady Catherine de Bourgh, not Lady Bracknell. She was just a little too sane. The shortened length could have been handled by a competent screenwriter, surely? Not characters filling in story gaps and helping along the audience all over the place. Elizabeth couldn't have come up with the £10K figure. And while they wanted to cut time with her learning of Darcy's involvement in Wickham's marriage, the lines didn't fit with Lydia. It was the worst case of incongruous exposition in the piece. It really is appalling stuff. Anyone who reviews it saying it works well in the context of the book is someone I frankly don't believe has read or understood the characterizations in the thing. Wright seems to think his characters are in the 1990s, not the 1709s from their behavior. I'm not convinced he has read the book. He certainly doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand Austen's acerbic wit or lightness of touch. He certainly made a dull plodding film out of it. What is possibly worse was the sad pathetic need of the chick-lit lovers to need the I love yous all over the place so they can sigh and get off on it. The fact that it has no place in a work by Austen is apparently irrelevant. Anyone who reviews it as a film alone? Well, more difficult for me, except I would note the poor acting, the weak Darcy, and the gurning skipping inane irritation of the whole thing. If you are going to adapt you can change a lot, but if it loses the spirit and key motivations, then don't insult the book by taking its title. Gorgeously filmed, smartly compacted Austen. Pride and Prejudice, 2005. I began my Pride and Prejudice attempt with the well-regarded 1995 5-hour classic with Colin Firth, a BBC mini-series. And it is so poorly filmed, visually, and so utterly about recreating the text, the Austen original, it ends up being awkward and sort of awful. As a movie, I know that is sacrilege to some. But I switched after an hour to this one, which I had seen before. And in 2 minutes I was sucked in. I think the biggest first point is this: to be true to Austen, you must find a way to put us there, to make us feel it. It's not about the text, the facts, the truth of the translation to film. It's about the effect and the final truth that this movie manages in a short 2 hours. So, yes, this is a filmic film. It's gorgeous and thoughtful for how it handles the scenes and the light, the movement of camera and the capturing of space. It's a wonderful film on a physical level. There are particular scenes, in the middle especially at a party, where the camera follows the action from character to character through several rooms for a glorious long take that just fills the sensation of being there beautifully. You might say this is Keira Knightley's movie, since she is Elizabeth. And she's kind of great. I've always had a reservation about her sincerity on screen. The cast around her is terrific, even the somewhat troublesome casting of Matthew Macfadyen as Mr. Darcy. I know that Mr. Darcy is meant to be unpleasant, but he comes off as somewhat wooden for too long here, as he does in Colin Firth's hands, too, in fact. But I warm to him by the end, so maybe it's perfect. And the other cast, including stars like Sutherland and Dench, is great. The director, Joe Wright, is basically unknown to me, though I see he did the more excessive Knightley vehicle, Atonement. So the tendency for dramatic ambience is a given, not to mention Anna Karenina, also starring Knightley. It all works. It's a kind of dramatization that purists probably hate, but for me it makes an original take on a classic that has its own dignity and beauty. And I'll add that Knightley is just 18 for this filming, and shows amazing depth for a young actress. Recommended. Absolutely perfect 2-hour adaptation. For years I have waited for a Pride and Prejudice that perfectly captured the wit, the intelligence, the passion, and the romance of Jane Austen's classic. The 1995 mini is fabulous, and I have watched it many times, but I have always been frustrated that while it got so much of the dialogue and the detail right, it somehow fell flat on some of the more subtle dynamics of the novel. Finally, this movie adaptation has captured what has before been missing. True, it took license regarding some of the verbiage and detail of the novel, but it ultimately completely captured the characters, their transformations, their strengths, their vulnerabilities, and their passions. You simply cannot do a definitive work on Pride and Prejudice in 2 hours. And this film doesn't try. But what it does attempt to capture the story and characters, it does beautifully. It is well acted, well directed, and connects as the book connected. While it has to rush and skimp on scenes and characters, it is the most authentic and true to the spirit of the novel version that I have ever seen. You simply do not want it to end. Well done. It was about time. 3 weddings and no funeral. This quintessentially English film is utterly charming, a very traditional interpretation of Jane Austen's 1813 novel that manages to entertain, amuse, and even move. First-time director Joe Wright has worked with television playwright Deborah Mogeka's script and a wonderful collection of mainly British actors to delight us. The versatile camera work, luscious countryside, grand settings, period costumes, and atmospheric music are evidence of a work on which much love has been lavished. At the heart of this triumph is the delightful 20-year-old Keira Knightley as the assured and sharp Elizabeth Bennet, the second of 5 daughters looking to be married off by an anxious mother. Knightley's rise in the thespian firmament has been meteoric, and this is her best performance to date in a role for which she is perfectly cast. Matthew Macfadyen is suitably brooding and gauche as Mr. Darcy, but the cast list is enlivened with splendid British character actors, including Brenda Blethyn as Lizzie's irascible mother, Tom Hollander as a diminutive cleric seeking a wife, and Judi Dench as the formidable Lady Catherine, plus the Canadian Donald Sutherland, Lizzie's wise father. This is a Georgian world in which social conventions present a veritable minefield for indiscretions or misunderstandings, and in which a formal dance can be as intricate an occasion as international diplomacy. Pride and Prejudice are only two of the obstacles to be overcome before inevitably true love brings Lizzie and her dark knight nose to nose. We don't even see a kiss. Passionate stuff indeed. Where are Colin and Hugh when you need them? Spoiler. In 1995, the 5 hours miniseries of Pride and Prejudice, with Colin Firth as Darcy and Jennifer L. as Elizabeth Bennet, was a big hit in England and the Netherlands. It even inspired Helen Fielding to write the Bridget Jones's novels. Therefore, whether you'll like the new 2005 movie mainly depends on the fact if you've seen the version that was done 10 years ago. If you have, you'll probably be very disappointed with the Knightley movie. If you haven't, well, maybe this romantic flick may be amiable enough for you. For those who aren't familiar with the story, Pride and Prejudice is a romantic costume drama that takes place in 19th century England and is based on the famous novel by Jane Austen. The story is about the Bennet family, a father, mother, and 5 or 6 daughters. The only way to secure the future of the children is to marry a party that owns a lot of money. Jane, the oldest sister, is beautiful but a little icy. She hopes to marry young Bingley, a rich aristocrat who just moved to a castle nearby. Her younger sister Elizabeth, the main character of the movie, wants to help her conquer his heart, but finds out that Bingley's best friend, the rich but arrogant Mr. Darcy, sabotages her plans. Elizabeth and Darcy start out as enemies, but as the story progresses they both find out that their opinions of each other are based on wrong information, pride, and prejudice. Let's bring the good news first. The new Pride and Prejudice is the big Keira Knightley show. Although she cannot top Jennifer L's performance, Knightley proves that she has real star power and that she is able to carry a movie. She looks lovely in this flick, she enchants you with her great smile and has the charms of a young Winona Ryder. Dame Judi Dench is excellent as Darcy's powerful aunt who is against a marriage, and Donald Sutherland has a both moving and funny scene at the end of the movie when he gives permission to Darcy to marry Elizabeth. The end of the movie is actually better than the one in the miniseries. Okay, then the bad news. I guess the main flaw of this new version is Darcy himself, a role played by Matthew Macfadyen. In the story he is rather dull and generally uninterested in what's going on. It must be difficult to replace Colin Firth as leading man, and the Darcy of the miniseries of course had more screen time to show his inner struggle. But the new Darcy is so dull that frankly you don't care if he ends up winning Elizabeth's heart or not. There is absolutely no spark between Knightley and Macfadyen. At the end of the movie they don't even kiss, and as an audience you couldn't care less. But Darcy isn't the only one that seems miscast. The new Mr. Bingley is despite his Jamie Oliver haircut a real nerd, and Mr. Wickham, who falls in love with Elizabeth but elopes with her younger sister, lacks the depth to be an interesting villain. Because of the time frame, the movie is less subtle than the miniseries. There's a lot to be told in 2 hours, and because of that there is hardly any suspense. Problems rise but they are solved within minutes. But what I really missed were the great dialogues. In the miniseries heavy emotions were always masqueraded by politeness. Darcy doesn't say, "Wow, it's great to see you, Elizabeth," but instead asks if her parents are in good health. The things that are not said were more interesting than the things that were indeed spoken out. The encounters between Elizabeth and Darcy always turned out to be great fights in which words and sentences were used as swords and daggers. I really missed that in the new version. Come to think of it, I also missed the humor you did see in Ang Lee's Sense and Sensibility, also based on a Jane Austen novel. Where is Hugh Grant when you need him? A friend of mine, also a journalist, really liked this movie. But he hadn't seen the Colin Firth/Jennifer L version from 1995. So perhaps I'm a little hard on what was presented to me last week, because the film does have its qualities. What happened to Mr. Darcy? The new Pride and Prejudice is pleasant enough, with stunning photography and locations, definitely a less polished adaptation than the BBC 1995 TV series. The action has been moved back about 20 years to when Jane Austen started writing the book, rather than when it was published, so the costumes and period details are not the usual imagery we have of Jane Austen's work. The Bennet girls are presented as true country girls, with unkempt hair and modest clothing, and the house looks worn out and messy, chickens walking in the courtyard and everything. That has some charm, but, I'm afraid, there are more serious letdowns. First of all, they had to compress a rich book like Pride and Prejudice in 2 hours, and that inevitably lead to cuts that didn't allow to sufficiently develop the many different characters. In particular, Mr. Wickham is a mere passing figure, while he has a much weightier role in the story. If you're familiar with the plot, it seems to run away at an alarming speed. Second, Mr. Darcy. I went open-minded, ready to give McFadden a chance, avoiding comparisons with Colin Firth. But there was nothing to save about him. He really is dreadful. Mr. Darcy is supposed to be proud and arrogant, but McFadden looks flat and inexpressive for virtually the whole film. When he tries to show his caring and sensitive side, he then turns into this big puppy-eyed jelly of a man, devoid of all masculinity. Well, I'm sorry, but comparisons are unavoidable. Colin Firth did it 1,000 times better. To be honest, all the male figures are nothing more than caricatures of Austen's characters. Mr. Bingley is exuberant, young, and naive, but in this film he's transformed into a babbling idiot. Mr. Collins is not bad, but not a patch on David Bamber's outstanding performance in the TV series. Even Donald Sutherland is not doing Mr. Bennet the justice the character deserves, with an underplayed performance. The women fare much better. Brenda Bethlen is perfectly adequate as Mrs. Bennet, and Dame Judi Dench is a tremendous Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The Bennet sisters are as you would expect them, though Jane is a bit underdeveloped. But it is Keira Knightley who really shines. Her Lizzie Bennet is as good if not better than Jennifer L's. You really do feel for her, more than you do for the rest of the characters. Shame there is virtually no spark between her feisty Lizzie and the stone-faced Mr. Darcy played by McFadden. In short, if you've not read the book nor seen the TV series, you'll enjoy this. If you've done one or both of the above, you will find flaws that might spoil the enjoyment. Now read the book. Spoiler. Please pay attention, this is not the lengthy 19th century novel by the genius Jane Austen, it is not 6 hours of glossy, BBC drama, this is 2 hours of cinematic storytelling. Once you realize that, you can forgive the omissions, quite a lot of the Wickham subplot, for example. The filmmakers have pitched this back a few years and mudded it up a bit. The Bennets are well off, they have servants and property, but it's all relative, and we are encouraged to see the brink on which the fates of these 5 young daughters teeters. Only Mrs. Bennet, often despised, but here much more than a comic caricature, realizes how important it is for these girls to make a good marriage. Austen knew this only too well, as she wrote her marvelous novels in the corners of other people's houses, with never a room of her own. The look of the movie is interesting, no glamorous, bust-line enhancing empire line dresses, no powder on the noses of the genuinely youthful cast, save Ms. Knightley, I suspect, and the curls, even when pinned up for parties, look a little untidy. I liked this aspect very much. Donald Sutherland's casting was a little eccentric, but he brought out a side of Mr. Bennet I had always suspected, a fond, weak man, aware of his daughter's vulnerability, but unable to do anything about it, knowing as he does that marriage may bring more disappointments than mere lack of money. Now to Miss Knightley, whose charms have always bemused me. I am prepared to admit that I may have been wrong, for here she is delightful. She delivers the difficult lines with conviction and passion, her bright eyes watching everywhere for examples of human folly and frailty, her affectionate nature not able to dismiss even her irritating mother from her care and concern. And falling in love. As she pieces together the clues as to Darcy's nature, she is beguiled, intrigued and, at last, smitten. And he gains a partner who understands him, something that Mr. Bennet knows is far more important than mere physical attraction. Matthew Macfadyen as Mr. Darcy suggests severe self-consciousness, arrogance masking his exposed and sensitive heart. Their scenes together are potent and persuasive. The minor characters do their part in expressing the other dimensions of the Georgian world, Lizzie's friend Charlotte making the hard-headed practical choice of marrying a man her inferior in everything except fortune, Wickham's seduction of the youngest Bennet requiring substantial payoff before she is rescued, along with her family, from debilitating scandal. I didn't think I could come across an actor to top David Bamber's performance in the BBC dramatization, but Tom Hollander is marvellous, raising even a little pity in the audience. The superior budget of the movie shows in the packed ball scenes, which are carried off with much bounce and energy, shadowed corners for Lizzie to catch her breath in, the sweep of the camera showing other intrigues and liaisons this film could not tell, but at least suggest are going on, in this pre-Victorian society. This film delivers a successful retelling of an adored book, which I now intend to reread again.